In the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean, where waves stretch endlessly toward distant horizons and depths plunge into darkness beyond human reach, there lies a secret, or so the story goes. It's a tale that has captivated explorers, mystics, archaeologists, and dreamers for more than a century. A legend of a lost continent called Mu, the supposed motherland of all human civilization. Unlike Atlantis, which Plato described in ancient texts, Mu emerged from the fevered imagination of the 19th and 20th centuries, born from mistranslations, wishful thinking, and a profound human yearning to uncover hidden truths about our past. This is not just a story about a sunken landmass somewhere beneath the Pacific waves. It's a narrative about how we construct meaning from fragments, how we fill the gaps in our knowledge with wonder, and how the most compelling myths are often those that tell us not about what was, but about what we desperately wish had been. The legend of Mu speaks to something deep within us, the belief that there was once a time when humanity lived in harmony, possessed secret wisdom, and dwelt in a paradise we've since forgotten. Before we dive into the depths of this extraordinary tale, I want to ask something of you. If you're finding yourself drawn into this story, if the mystery of Mu is beginning to work its way into your imagination, please consider subscribing to this channel and hitting that like button. Your support helps us continue creating these deep explorations of history's most fascinating mysteries. And if you have thoughts about lost continents, ancient civilizations, or the line between myth and reality, share them in the comments below. Now, let's begin our journey into one of the most enduring legends of the modern age, the lost continent of Mu. The story properly begins not in some ancient civilization, but in the comparatively recent past, during a time when the world was being rediscovered, remapped, and reimagined. The 19th century was an age of tremendous exploration and equally tremendous speculation. Archaeologists were uncovering the ruins of civilizations that had been lost to memory, from the temples of Egypt to the cities of Mesopotamia to the mysterious stone heads of Easter Island. Each new discovery seemed to push back the boundaries of human history, revealing that our ancestors were far more sophisticated, far more widespread, and far more mysterious than anyone had previously imagined. It was also an era when scientific theories were still forming, when the mechanisms that shaped the Earth were not yet fully understood. Before the theory of plate tectonics revolutionized geology in the mid-20th century, scientists proposed all manner of land bridges, sunken continents, and vanished land masses to explain the distribution of animals, plants, and human cultures across the globe. Into this world of discovery and speculation came Augustus Le Plongeon, a French-American photographer and self-taught archaeologist who would plant the seeds of the Mu legend. Born in 1825, Le Plongeon was a man of remarkable energy and equally remarkable imagination. In the 1870s, he traveled to the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico, where he conducted excavations at ancient Mayan sites. At a time when archaeological methodology was still in its infancy, Le Plongeon approached the ruins with enthusiasm but little scientific rigor. He was particularly fascinated by the symbols and inscriptions he found carved into the stone walls and monuments of these ancient cities. These hieroglyphs, written in a script that few could read, seemed to Le Plongeon to contain profound secrets about human history. Le Plongeon believed he had found evidence of connections between the Maya civilization and other ancient cultures around the world. He was convinced that the Maya were not simply an isolated culture that had flourished in Central America, but rather the descendants of an even older, more advanced civilization. This notion fit neatly into the intellectual currents of his time. Many European and American scholars were committed to what is now called diffusionism, the idea that major cultural achievements must have originated from a single source and then spread outward to other regions. This view was often colored by prejudice, suggesting that certain cultures were incapable of independent achievement and must have received their knowledge from somewhere else. In his interpretation of Mayan texts, particularly a document known as the Troano manuscript, now called the Madrid Codex, Le Plongeon claimed to have discovered references to a lost land. He wasn't working alone in this interpretation. A French priest and scholar named Charles H.N. Brasseur de Bourbourg had previously attempted to translate Mayan texts using what was called the Delanda alphabet, a key supposedly created by a Spanish bishop in the 16th century. Brasseur's translation was deeply flawed. He misread a symbol that he interpreted as Mu, which he believed referred to a land that had been submerged by some ancient catastrophe. Le Plongeon seized upon this interpretation and expanded it dramatically. According to Le Plongeon's reading of these texts, there had once existed a great landmass called the Land of Mu. He initially placed this lost continent in the Atlantic Ocean and identified it with the legendary Atlantis described by Plato. In Le Plongeon's version of history, Mu, or Atlantis as he sometimes called it, had been the cradle of human civilization. When this continent was destroyed by volcanic activity and earthquakes, its survivors fled to various parts of the world, carrying their advanced knowledge with them. Some went east to Egypt, where they founded the great civilization along the Nile. Others traveled to Central America and became the ancestors of the Maya. In this way, Luplongen explained the similarities he believed he saw between Egyptian hieroglyphs and Mayan glyphs, between the pyramids of Egypt and the step temples of Mesoamerica. Luplongen even gave names and personalities to the people of Mu. He spoke of Queen Mu, who fled the catastrophe and eventually reached Egypt, where she was transformed in legend into the goddess Isis. He described Prince Ko and the palace intrigues that supposedly unfolded in the final days before Mu's destruction. These were not scholarly reconstructions based on careful analysis of evidence. They were romantic elaborations, stories that filled the gaps in the historical record with imagination and drama. Luplongen was not deliberately deceiving anyone. He genuinely believed in his interpretations. But he was creating a myth as much as uncovering a history. The professional archaeological community of Luplongen's time was skeptical of his claims. His translations were questioned, his methodology criticized, and his conclusions rejected by mainstream scholars. But this did not diminish the power of his ideas in the popular imagination. The notion of a lost continent, a mother civilization from which all others spring, was deeply appealing. It offered a grand narrative that connected disparate cultures, explained mysterious similarities, and suggested that human history was far older and more complex than conventional wisdom allowed. Luplongen had tapped into something profound, a hunger for hidden knowledge, for secrets buried in the past, for the possibility that our ancestors knew things we have forgotten. The idea of Mu might have remained a footnote in the history of pseudo-archaeology, a curious mistake made by an overly imaginative explorer, if it had not been picked up and transformed by another figure who would become synonymous with the lost continent. This man was James Churchward, and he would take Luplongen's seed of an idea and grow it into a vast narrative that would capture the imagination of readers around the world. Where Luplongen had been tentative and had conflated Mu with Atlantis, Churchward would be bold and specific, moving the lost continent from the Atlantic to the Pacific Ocean and constructing an entire cosmology around it. But before we delve into Churchward's grand vision, it's worth pausing to consider the context in which these ideas were flourishing. The late 19th century was not just an age of archaeological discovery. It was also a time of great intellectual ferment and cultural anxiety. The theory of evolution, published by Charles Darwin in 1859, had revolutionized biology but also raised troubling questions about human origins and the place of humanity in the natural world. Where did we come from? What made us different from other animals? Were we simply the result of random processes, or was there something special, something planned about human existence? These were not merely academic questions. They touched on deeply held beliefs about religion, morality, and the meaning of life. At the same time, Western imperial powers were expanding their reach across the globe, encountering cultures and civilizations that challenged European assumptions about progress and civilization. The ruins of ancient cities in Asia, Africa, and the Americas revealed that so-called primitive peoples had once built impressive monuments and developed sophisticated societies. How could this be reconciled with the prevailing belief in Western superiority? One answer was to suggest that these achievements were not really theirs, that some other older civilization had taught them, had given them the knowledge they needed to build their pyramids and temples and cities. This explanation allowed people to maintain their prejudices while still marveling at the achievements of the past. The idea of lost continents fit perfectly into this intellectual landscape. They provided an explanation for the distribution of similar cultural practices and monuments across widely separated regions. They offered a way to think about human origins that was more romantic and mysterious than Darwin's slow accumulation of small changes over millions of years. And they suggested that there had been golden ages in the past, times when humanity had achieved a level of wisdom and harmony that had since been lost. In an era of rapid industrialization, urbanization, and social change, when traditional ways of life were being disrupted and the future seemed uncertain, the notion of a lost paradise was profoundly comforting. It implied that if we could just remember what our ancestors knew, if we could just rediscover the secrets of the past, we might be able to reclaim something precious that had been lost. Augustus Luplongen's ideas about Mu emerged from this fertile soil. He was not simply making up stories out of whole cloth. He was responding to genuine puzzles and mysteries, even if his solutions to those puzzles were wrong. The similarities between ancient cultures on different continents are real, though they have better explanations than a lost mother civilization. The distribution of certain plants, animals, and genetic markers across oceans requires explanation, though modern biology provides those explanations through evolution and migration rather than land bridges and sunken continents. Le Plongeon was asking the right questions even if his answers were flights of fancy. And in asking those questions, he opened a door through which others would walk, elaborating on his vision and transforming Mu from a tentative proposal into a full-fledged mythology. The stage was set for James Churchward to enter and claim his place as the high priest of the lost continent of Mu. James Churchward was born in 1851 in Devon, England, into a respectable middle-class family. His early life remained somewhat obscure, though he later claimed to have served in the British military and spent time in India. By his own account, it was during this period in India that he stumbled upon the secret that would define the rest of his life. Churchward said that while stationed there, likely during the 1860s or 70s, he befriended a high-ranking priest at a Hindu temple. This priest, Churchward claimed, possessed knowledge of ancient texts that were hidden from the world, sacred tablets written in a language so old that only a handful of people on earth could still read it. The priest showed these tablets to the young Churchward and, impressed by his genuine interest and respect, agreed to teach him the language and help him translate the texts. These were no ordinary tablets, according to Churchward. They were written in what he called the Nakal language, supposedly the original tongue of humanity before languages diverged and multiplied across the earth. The tablets, Churchward said, had been inscribed either in Burma or in an even more ancient land, a lost continent in the Pacific Ocean that the tablets themselves called Mu. The story recorded on these clay tablets was nothing less than the history of human civilization, stretching back 50,000 years or more. They told of the creation of the world, the emergence of humanity, the rise of a great empire that spanned much of the Pacific, and the eventual catastrophic destruction that sent that empire to the bottom of the ocean. Churchward claimed to have spent years studying these tablets, learning the Nakal script, and piecing together the incredible narrative they contained. After leaving India, Churchward immigrated to the United States, where he worked as an engineer and inventor. He was apparently quite successful in his professional life, holding patents for various metallurgical processes and steel alloys. One of his inventions was NCV steel, a nickel-chrome vanadium alloy used for armor plating on ships during World War I. This work brought him considerable wealth, and by 1914, after a patent dispute was settled in his favor, Churchward retired to a large estate in Connecticut. It was in this retirement that he turned his attention fully to the mysteries he believed he had uncovered decades earlier in India. He began to write, synthesizing his memories of the Nakal tablets with other sources he had collected over the years, ancient manuscripts, archaeological reports, symbols and motifs from various cultures, and his own speculative interpretations. In 1926, when Churchward was 75 years old, he published his first book, The Lost Continent of Mu, Motherland of Man. This was followed by several sequels over the next decade, including The Children of Mu, The Sacred Symbols of Mu, The Cosmic Forces of Mu, and the second book of The Cosmic Forces of Mu. In these volumes, Churchward laid out his vision of Mu in extraordinary detail. He was not content merely to assert that such a continent had existed. He described its geography, its population, its cities, its government, its religion, and its ultimate fate with a specificity that was either remarkably confident or remarkably reckless, depending on one's perspective. These books sold well and found an enthusiastic audience among people fascinated by ancient mysteries and alternative histories. To this day, they remain in print and continue to influence those interested in lost continents and hidden knowledge. So what exactly did Churchward claim about Mu? According to his reconstruction, the continent of Mu had been enormous, stretching some 5,000 miles from east to west and over 3,000 miles from north to south. This would make it larger than South America and comparable in size to Africa. It was located in the Pacific Ocean, extending roughly from the Mariana Islands in the west to Easter Island in the east, and from Hawaii in the north to Fiji and other South Pacific islands in the south. The modern Pacific Islands, in Churchward's view, were merely the mountain peaks of Mu that remained above water after the rest of the continent sank. This vast landmass had supported a population of 64 million people at the height of its power, spread across 7 major cities and numerous smaller settlements. The inhabitants were organized into 10 tribes, but all followed a single government and a single religion, living in remarkable harmony and unity. The civilization of Mu, according to Churchward, flourished between 50,000 and 12,000 years ago. This timeline placed it far earlier than any civilization recognized by conventional archaeology, earlier than the Sumerians, earlier than the Egyptians, earlier than any of the cultures that historians considered the cradles of civilization. The people of Mu, whom Churchward called the Nakals, were described as technologically and spiritually advanced, possessing knowledge that in many respects exceeded our own. They understood principles of astronomy, architecture, mathematics, and engineering that would not be rediscovered until modern times. They built great temples and palaces, created works of art of exquisite beauty, and developed a sophisticated writing system that would later influence scripts in Egypt, India, Central America, and other parts of the world. Churchward was particularly insistent on describing the racial characteristics of the Mu civilization. He claimed that the dominant people were of a white race, or in some descriptions, a melanated race, though these racial characterizations reflected the prejudices and pseudoscientific racial theories of his era rather than any genuine historical evidence. He suggested that different ethnic groups around the world could trace their ancestry back to the various tribes of Mu, and that the dispersal of Mu's people after the continent's destruction explained the distribution of human populations across the earth. These ideas, while reflecting Churchward's times, are now understood to be completely at odds with genetic, archaeological, and anthropological evidence, which shows that human migrations followed very different patterns than Churchward imagined. The religion of Mu, as Churchward described it, was a form of monotheism that recognized a single supreme creator deity. The Nakals were a priestly class who served as intermediaries between this deity and the people, and who preserved and transmitted sacred knowledge from generation to generation. The name of the supreme god, according to Churchward, was Ra, the same name used by the ancient Egyptians for their sun god. This was not a coincidence, in Churchward's view, but evidence that Egyptian religion derived directly from the teachings of Mu. He also identified the king of Mu as being called Ra, further cementing this supposed connection. The sacred symbols of Mu, Churchward claimed, could be found scattered across the world in the art and architecture of later civilizations. Symbols of the sun, representations of birds, geometric patterns like the swastika, which Churchward interpreted as a sacred cross predating its appropriation by Nazi Germany, and images relating to cosmic forces all supposedly originated in Mu and were carried to other lands by Mu's colonists and refugees. The government of Mu was portrayed as enlightened and benevolent, ruling over a people who lived in peace and prosperity. The cities were opulent, filled with temples decorated with gold and precious stones, palaces with gardens and fountains, and public buildings where knowledge was taught and preserved. The Nakals, as the educated elite, were astronomers and philosophers, teachers and healers. They traveled to the far corners of the world, establishing colonies and teaching the less advanced peoples they encountered. According to Churchward, it was the Nakals who brought civilization to places like Egypt, Mesopotamia, India, and Central America. The great monuments of these regions, the pyramids of Egypt and Central America, the temples of India, the stone statues of Easter Island, were all supposedly influenced by or directly built by colonists from Mu who carried with them the architectural knowledge of the motherland. The destruction of Mu, as Churchward told the story, was both sudden and catastrophic. Around 12,000 years ago, a series of tremendous earthquakes and volcanic eruptions shook the continent. The land, which Churchward claimed was geologically unstable because it sat atop vast underground chambers filled with gas and molten rock, could not withstand these forces. In the space of a single night, or perhaps a few days, the entire continent broke apart and sank beneath the Pacific Ocean. 64 million people perished, drowned by the massive tsunamis that accompanied the destruction or buried under the collapsing buildings and landscapes. Only a few managed to escape, fleeing in ships to the edges of the Pacific where they found refuge on what would become the coasts of Asia, the Americas, and the Pacific Islands. These survivors became the ancestors of later civilizations, carrying with them fragmentary memories of the great land they had lost, memories that would be preserved in flood myths and legends of lost paradises found in cultures around the world. Churchward supported his narrative with what he claimed were two sets of ancient tablets. The first were the Nakal tablets he said he had studied in India, though he never produced these tablets, never revealed the location of the temple where he supposedly saw them, and never provided independent verification that they existed. The second set consisted of stone tablets discovered in Mexico by William Niven, a geologist and amateur archaeologist, in excavations conducted in the early 1920s. Niven uncovered thousands of inscribed stone objects near Mexico City, which he and Churchward believed were ancient records. Churchward claimed he could read these tablets because they were written in the same Nakal language he had learned in India. He said they confirmed the story told by the Indian tablets, providing additional details about Mu's history and its connection to the civilizations of the Americas. However, the Niven tablets have never been accepted as genuine ancient artifacts by the archaeological community. Most experts who have examined them believe they are relatively modern objects, either prayer aids created by local people in the colonial or post-colonial period, or possibly even forgeries made to sell to gullible collectors. The script on the tablets bears no resemblance to any known ancient writing system, and carbon dating and other analytical techniques have failed to support claims of great antiquity. Furthermore, Churchward's interpretations of the symbols on the tablets were completely subjective, based on his own invented system rather than any established linguistic or epigraphic principles. He saw what he wanted to see, finding confirmation for beliefs he already held rather than objectively analyzing the evidence. The same criticism applies to Churchward's treatment of other ancient texts and symbols. He scoured religious scriptures, mythological tales, and archaeological reports from around the world, looking for references to Mu. He found them everywhere, but only because he was willing to interpret the evidence in whatever way suited his narrative. A reference in Hindu scripture to people coming from the land of their birth in the East became evidence for Mu in the Pacific. The symbol of the sun, found in nearly every ancient culture because the sun is universally important to human life, became evidence of a common origin in sun-worshipping Mu. Similar motifs in art from different cultures, which can be explained by common human psychology and limited artistic options when working with simple geometric shapes, became evidence of direct cultural transmission from Mu. Churchward was engaging in what modern scholars call cherry-picking, selecting only the evidence that supports one's hypothesis while ignoring everything that contradicts it. Despite these serious flaws, Churchward's books found a receptive audience. They were written in an engaging, confident style that made the incredible seem plausible. Churchward presented himself as a scholar who had uncovered truths that the academic establishment was either ignorant of or actively suppressing. This narrative of hidden knowledge revealed to the persistent seeker is powerfully appealing, especially to those who feel alienated from or skeptical of mainstream institutions. The books promised readers that human history was far more interesting, far more mysterious, and far more ancient than they had been taught in school. They offered a grand narrative that connected cultures across the globe and pushed the origins of civilization back tens of thousands of years. And they suggested that there was wisdom in the ancient world that had been lost, wisdom that if rediscovered might help solve the problems of the modern world. Churchward lived to see his books become popular, though he never saw mainstream academic acceptance. He died in 1936 at the age of 85, still convinced that he had revealed the truth about humanity's origins. His legacy has been mixed. To skeptics and scientists, he is a cautionary tale about the dangers of letting imagination run ahead of evidence, about how easy it is to construct elaborate theories on shaky foundations. To believers and enthusiasts, he is a visionary who dared to challenge conventional wisdom and who preserved knowledge that might otherwise have been lost. The truth, as is often the case, lies somewhere in between. Churchward was neither a deliberate fraud nor a reliable historian. He was a man of his time, influenced by the ideas and prejudices of the early 20th century, who constructed an elaborate myth that addressed the anxieties and aspirations of that era. To truly understand the appeal of the Mu legend, we need to delve deeper into the specific claims that Churchward made about this supposed lost civilization. It wasn't enough for him to assert that a continent had existed in the Pacific and then sank. He needed to paint a vivid picture of what life in Mu had been like, to make the lost motherland feel real and tangible. The result was a portrait of an ancient utopia, a civilization that combined advanced technology with spiritual enlightenment, material prosperity with social harmony. It was a vision that resonated with many readers and that continues to influence how people imagine lost civilizations to this day. The physical geography of Mu, as Churchward described it, was diverse and abundant. The continent was not a uniform landmass, but rather a collection of large islands and smaller archipelagos connected by land bridges and shallow seas. In the center were high mountain ranges, their peaks covered with snow even in the tropical climate. Rivers ran down from these mountains through lush valleys and fertile plains, supporting agriculture and providing water for the cities and towns. The coasts were fringed with beaches and harbors, perfect for maritime trade and fishing. The climate was generally warm and mild, allowing for multiple harvests each year and supporting a rich diversity of plant and animal life. In Churchward's telling, Mu was a paradise, a land blessed by nature and carefully stewarded by its inhabitants. The cities of Mu were marvels of architecture and urban planning. The capital, whose name Churchward sometimes gave as Hiranipura or simply the City of the Golden Gates, was supposedly located on a large plateau in the Central Highlands. It was built around a great temple complex dedicated to the worship of the supreme deity. This temple was constructed of massive stone blocks, fitted together with such precision that not even a knife blade could pass between them, a claim that echoes descriptions of Inca masonry at sites like Sacsayhuaman in Peru. The walls were adorned with gold and silver plates, with precious gems, and with intricate carvings depicting the creation of the world and the history of the Nakal people. The city was laid out in a geometric pattern, with broad avenues radiating from the temple complex like the spokes of a wheel. Public squares hosted markets where goods from across the continent and even from distant colonies were traded. Gardens and fountains provided green spaces and water features, making the city not just functional but beautiful. The other 6 major cities of Mu, though Churchward provided less detail about them, were said to be similarly impressive. Each had its own temple, its own administrative center, and its own distinct character and specialties. Some were centers of learning, housing great libraries where the wisdom of the ages was preserved on clay tablets. Others were hubs of manufacturing and craftsmanship, where artisans produced goods of exquisite quality. Still others were primarily agricultural centers, managing the farms and orchards that fed the population. But all were connected by a network of roads that allowed for rapid communication and trade across the continent. Churchward even suggested that the Mu civilization had developed sophisticated forms of transportation, though he was vague about the details, hinting at advanced ships and possibly even flying craft, though this latter claim has more to do with later interpretations by UFO enthusiasts than anything Churchward explicitly stated. The people of Mu, the Nakals, were described as physically impressive, intelligent, and spiritually evolved. They lived long lives, some supposedly reaching ages of hundreds of years, though Churchward never explained how this was possible or why human lifespans would have subsequently decreased. They were educated from childhood in the sacred knowledge preserved by the priestly class, knowledge of mathematics, astronomy, medicine, philosophy, and the nature of the universe. Every citizen of Mu, according to Churchward, was literate and numerate, a stark contrast to the vast majority of people in ancient civilizations known to history, where literacy was typically restricted to a small elite. The Nakals used a sophisticated writing system, with characters that combined phonetic and ideographic elements, allowing them to express complex ideas with precision. The religion of Mu was central to every aspect of life. Unlike the polytheistic religions that would develop in later civilizations like Greece, Rome, and Egypt, the religion of Mu recognized only one God, a supreme creator who had brought the universe into existence through an act of will. This God was symbolized by the sun, which was seen as the visible manifestation of divine power and benevolence. The sun gave life, provided light and warmth, marked the passage of time with its daily and seasonal cycles, and was thus the perfect symbol for the ultimate source of all existence. The Nakal priests taught that humans were spiritual beings who had descended into material form in order to experience and learn in the physical world. The goal of life was to achieve enlightenment, to remember one's divine origin, and ultimately to reunite with the Creator after death. This religious philosophy, according to Churchward, was the foundation for all later religions. The monotheism of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, the complex spiritual systems of Hinduism and Buddhism, even the sun worship of ancient Egypt and Peru, all supposedly derived from the original teachings of Mu. As colonists from Mu spread across the world, they brought this religion with them, though over time it became corrupted, fragmented, and mixed with local beliefs and practices. The symbols that appeared in these later religions, the cross, the triangle, the circle, representations of the sun and stars, were all supposedly inherited from Mu, where they had specific meanings related to the cosmic forces and the nature of the divine. Churchward devoted an entire book, The Sacred Symbols of Mu, to decoding these symbols and demonstrating their supposed common origin. The government of Mu was presented as a form of enlightened monarchy or theocracy. The king, who bore the title Ra, was not just a political leader but also the highest religious authority, considered to be the earthly representative of the supreme God. His authority was absolute, but Churchward insisted it was exercised with wisdom and compassion. The king was advised by a council of elder priests, the most learned of the Nakals, who helped him make decisions for the benefit of all the people. There was no written law code because none was needed. The teachings of the religion provided all the guidance necessary for living a just and harmonious life. Crime was supposedly rare, and when it did occur, it was dealt with through education and rehabilitation rather than punishment. The society was stratified, with the priests and scholars at the top, followed by artisans and merchants, then farmers and laborers, but Churchward claimed there was no exploitation or oppression. Everyone had a role to play and everyone's contribution was valued. Education in Mu was universal and began at an early age. Children were taught to read and write, to understand the movements of the stars and planets, to appreciate music and art, and above all to grasp the spiritual truth that underpinned their civilization. The most promising students would be selected to undergo further training as priests, learning the deepest mysteries and becoming guardians of the sacred knowledge. This knowledge included not just religious and philosophical teachings but also practical sciences: how to predict eclipses and astronomical events, how to build structures that could withstand earthquakes, how to heal diseases with herbs and other natural remedies, and how to navigate by the stars across vast ocean distances. Some of this knowledge, Churchward suggested, involved principles that modern science has only recently rediscovered or has yet to understand fully. The economy of Mu was apparently robust and sophisticated. Agriculture provided the foundation, with large-scale farming operations producing grains, fruits, vegetables, and other crops. Livestock was raised for meat, milk, and leather. Fishing in the coastal waters and in the rivers provided an additional source of protein. But Mu was not just an agricultural society, it was also highly developed in terms of manufacturing and trade. Craftsmen produced pottery, textiles, metalwork, jewelry, and tools. There was a monetary system that facilitated trade, though Churchward was vague about the details. Ships carried goods from one part of the continent to another and even ventured beyond Mu to colonies in Asia, the Americas, and other lands. The colonies were not conquered territories but rather settlements where people from Mu established communities and introduced their culture and knowledge to the local populations, supposedly living in cooperation and mutual benefit. This image of Mu as the near-perfect society, a golden age of peace and prosperity, was central to Churchward's appeal. He was writing during a period that had seen the devastation of World War I, the upheavals of the Russian Revolution, and the economic instability that would soon lead to the Great Depression. His readers lived in a world that seemed chaotic, violent, and morally adrift. The idea that there had once been a time when humanity lived according to higher principles, when knowledge and spirituality went hand in hand, when people worked together rather than fighting each other, was profoundly comforting. Mu represented everything that the modern world seemed to lack: unity, purpose, wisdom, and harmony with both nature and the divine. But this golden age, as all golden ages must, came to an end. According to Churchward, the destruction of Mu was the result of geological forces that the inhabitants, for all their knowledge, could not control or predict. The continent rested on a foundation that was fundamentally unstable. Beneath the land were vast chambers filled with volcanic gases under tremendous pressure. For thousands of years, these chambers had remained sealed. But eventually the pressure became too great. Fissures opened in the Earth's crust, releasing the gases and allowing magma to rise toward the surface. Earthquakes began to shake the land with increasing frequency and intensity. Volcanoes that had been dormant for centuries erupted with terrifying violence, spewing ash and lava across the landscape. The people of Mu watched in growing horror as their world began to come apart. The priests consulted their astronomical observations and their sacred texts, searching for explanations and solutions, but found none. The earthquakes grew stronger, toppling buildings and opening great cracks in the ground. The sea began to behave strangely, withdrawing from the shores and then rushing back in massive waves that swept away coastal settlements. Volcanic eruptions darkened the sky, covering the land in ash and making it difficult to breathe. Panic spread as people realized that something unprecedented was happening, something that threatened the very existence of their civilization. And then, in a final cataclysm, the continent of Mu broke apart and sank beneath the Pacific Ocean. Churchward described this as happening over the course of a single night, though some of his accounts suggest it may have taken a few days. The land literally dropped away, falling into the abyss as the underground chambers collapsed. The sea rushed in, creating tsunamis of unimaginable size that radiated outward from the disaster site. 64 million people, the entire population of Mu, were killed, drowned in the floods, or buried under the rubble of their once great cities. Only a tiny fraction managed to escape, those who happened to be aboard ships at sea or who lived in the few areas that remained above water as the rest of the continent sank. These survivors sailed to the shores of Asia, the Americas, and the Pacific Islands, bringing with them the knowledge and culture of Mu, but also carrying the trauma of having witnessed the destruction of their entire world. Churchward dated this catastrophe to approximately 12,000 years ago, placing it at the end of the last ice age. This timing was not accidental. It coincided with a period when there actually were significant climate changes and sea level rises as the great ice sheets that had covered much of North America and Europe melted. Churchward suggested that Mu's destruction was part of a broader pattern of global catastrophes at this time, linking it to flood myths found in many different cultures, including the biblical story of Noah's Arkansas. He argued that the worldwide legends of a great deluge that destroyed an earlier world were not just myths but memories of real events, and that Mu's sinking was the most dramatic of these events. This, then, was Churchward's vision of the lost continent, a vast, powerful, enlightened civilization that had flourished for tens of thousands of years before being suddenly and completely destroyed. It was a narrative of rise and fall, of human achievement and natural catastrophe, of knowledge gained and then tragically lost. And it was a story that, despite its complete lack of scientific evidence, would prove to have remarkable staying power in the popular imagination. One of the most striking aspects of James Churchward's work on Mu was his apparent ability to find evidence for the lost continent in the most unlikely places. He claimed that symbols, inscriptions, and architectural features from ancient civilizations around the world all bore the mark of Mu's influence. By his reading, the fingerprints of this vanished culture were everywhere, if only one knew how to recognize them. This approach of finding connections between disparate cultures and interpreting them as evidence of a common source is a hallmark of what scholars now call pseudo-archaeology, but it's also what made Churchward's books so compelling to many readers. He was offering them a key to unlock mysteries, a way to see patterns and meanings that others had missed. Central to Churchward's claimed evidence were the stone tablets discovered by William Niven in Mexico. William Niven was an American-born geologist and amateur archaeologist who worked in Mexico in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Starting around 1921, Niven conducted excavations in the Valley of Mexico, in the area around Santiago Ahuizotla near Mexico City. During these excavations, he uncovered thousands of small inscribed stone objects. These objects were generally flat or slightly rounded, made of various types of stone, and bore carved symbols and figures. Niven was convinced that he had discovered ancient written records, possibly dating back thousands of years, and he sought out experts who might be able to decipher them. James Churchward heard about Niven's discoveries and traveled to Mexico to examine the tablets personally. When he saw them, he was immediately convinced that they were written in the same Nakal language he claimed to have learned in India decades earlier. According to Churchward, these tablets confirmed everything the Indian tablets had told him about Mu. They described the same events, used the same symbols, and provided additional details about Mu's history and its connection to the Americas. Churchward claimed that the tablets were between 11,000 and 12,000 years old, predating any known civilization in the Americas and providing proof that the Valley of Mexico had been influenced or even settled by refugees from Mu. However, the Niven tablets have never been accepted as genuine ancient artifacts by the archaeological community. When other scholars examined them, they found no resemblance to any known ancient writing system from Mesoamerica or anywhere else. The carving style was crude, the symbols appeared to be a random assortment of simple geometric shapes and stick figures, and there was no indication of any systematic grammar or linguistic structure. Several archaeologists who reviewed the tablets concluded that they were likely modern objects, perhaps prayer aids or folk art created by local people in the recent past, or possibly even deliberate forgeries made to sell to collectors. Some suggested they might be a form of mnemonic device used by indigenous communities to remember prayers or stories, not a true writing system at all. Independent analyses have failed to support claims of great antiquity for the tablets. The stone itself, while old, shows signs of being carved relatively recently, based on the weathering patterns and the condition of the carved surfaces. No other artifacts from the same alleged time period have been found in association with the tablets, which would be expected if they were truly ancient. And most damningly, the script appears nowhere else, not on any other artifacts, not in any other archaeological context, despite Churchward's claims that this was the universal language of an advanced civilization that influenced cultures around the world. If Nakal writing had been so widespread, we should find examples of it everywhere. Instead, we find it only on these dubious tablets from a single location, all discovered by one person. Churchward's interpretations of the symbols on the tablets were entirely subjective. He had no linguistic training, no methodology for decipherment that could be tested or verified by others, and no independent confirmation of his readings. He simply looked at the symbols and decided what they meant based on what he wanted them to mean. A circle might represent the sun, or the earth, or the creator god, or any number of other things, depending on what fit the narrative Churchward was constructing. A line might be a ray of light, or a path, or a connection between 2 points. Crosses, triangles, spirals, and other geometric shapes were interpreted according to his own invented system of symbolic meanings. This is not how legitimate decipherment works. Successful decoding of ancient scripts requires finding patterns, testing hypotheses against the full corpus of texts, looking for grammatical structures and recurring phrases, and building up knowledge gradually and systematically. But the Mexican tablets were only one part of Churchward's claimed evidence. He also pointed to architectural features, particularly in Polynesia, as proof of Mu's existence. The most famous example is Easter Island, known to its inhabitants as Rapa Nui, with its enormous stone statues called moai. These massive sculptures, some weighing up to 80 tons and standing over 30 feet tall, have long been a source of fascination and mystery. How did a relatively small population on an isolated island, using only stone tools, manage to carve, transport, and erect these colossal figures? Churchward had an answer. The moai were built by the descendants of Mu, who retained knowledge of advanced construction techniques from their ancestors. Churchward focused particular attention on the pukeo, the cylindrical top-knots or hats that rest on top of some of the moai. He claimed that these were representations of the sun, painted red to symbolize the sun's rays, and that they proved the Easter Islanders were sun worshippers whose religion derived from Mu. He even stated incorrectly that some pukeo were made of red sandstone, though in fact they are carved from red scoria, a volcanic rock native to the island. Churchward also described the ahu, the stone platforms on which the moai rest, as being constructed of platform-like accumulations of cut and dressed stone that were supposedly left awaiting shipment to other parts of Mu for building temples. This interpretation makes no sense, as the ahu are clearly integrated structures built in place, not piles of building materials ready to be transported elsewhere. Modern archaeology has provided a far more mundane but also more fascinating explanation for the moai and the culture that created them. The Rapa Nui people arrived on Easter Island around the year 1300 in the Common Era, as part of the broader Polynesian expansion across the Pacific. They developed a unique culture, with the moai representing ancestor figures intended to watch over and protect the community. The statues were carved in a quarry on the side of Reno Raraku volcano, then moved across the island using a combination of ropes, sledges, and possibly a technique of walking the statues upright by rocking them from side to side. The pukeo were added as a finishing touch, representing the traditional top-knot hairstyle worn by Polynesian men. Far from being the work of refugees from a lost continent, the moai are a testament to the ingenuity and determination of the Rapa Nui people themselves. Churchward also found supposed evidence of Mu in other Pacific islands and in the ancient structures of South and Central America. He pointed to the massive stone walls of Sacsayhuaman near Cusco in Peru, with their precisely fitted blocks, as examples of Mu's architectural style. He noted similarities between the stepped pyramids of Mesoamerica and the ziggurats of Mesopotamia, suggesting these structures must have a common origin rather than being independent inventions. He drew connections between Egyptian hieroglyphs and Mayan glyphs, between Hindu symbols and Polynesian tattoos, between the flood myths of Mesopotamia and the creation stories of the Americas. In every case, his methodology was the same: identify superficial similarities, assert that these could not be coincidental or the result of independent development, and conclude they must therefore indicate direct influence from Mu. This approach is fundamentally flawed for several reasons. First, it assumes that humans in different cultures cannot independently arrive at similar solutions to similar problems. In fact, they can and do. Pyramids, for instance, are simply the most stable structure you can build with stone blocks if you want to create something tall and permanent. The broad base provides support, and the tapered shape resists collapse. It's not surprising that cultures in Egypt, Mesopotamia, and Mesoamerica all built pyramids, because it's the obvious solution to the engineering challenge they faced. Similarly, many cultures developed sun worship independently, because the sun's importance to agriculture and daily life makes it a natural focus for religious attention. Second, Churchward consistently ignored or dismissed the real historical and archaeological evidence for how cultures developed and influenced each other. We have abundant evidence, for instance, for the gradual development of Egyptian writing from simpler pictographs to the complex hieroglyphic system. We can trace the evolution of Mayan culture from earlier Olmec and other Mesoamerican societies, seeing how their writing, architecture, and religious practices developed over centuries. There's no need to invoke a mysterious lost continent to explain these developments. They are the natural result of human creativity, cultural exchange along established trade routes, and the accumulation of knowledge over generations. Third, Churchward was guilty of what archaeologists call cherry-picking or confirmation bias. He looked for evidence that supported his hypothesis and ignored everything that contradicted it. For every similarity he found between cultures, There were dozens or hundreds of differences that would be impossible to explain if they all derived from a common Mu origin. Egyptian hieroglyphs and Mayan glyphs may both be picture-based writing systems, but they work in fundamentally different ways and represent completely unrelated languages. Hindu symbols and Polynesian tattoos may share some geometric shapes, but the meanings attached to those shapes and the context in which they're used are utterly distinct. Perhaps most tellingly, Churchward never addressed the most obvious problem with his theory. If Mu had been such a vast and powerful empire, with colonies around the world and influence over all ancient civilizations, where is the physical evidence? Where are the cities, the buildings, the tools, the pottery, the countless mundane artifacts that any real civilization would leave behind? We have found the remains of civilizations that are far older than Churchward's Mu, settlements dating back tens of thousands of years, the earliest evidence of agriculture and permanent structures, burial sites and art from the dawn of human culture. But none of this evidence shows any connection to a Pacific Ocean civilization. There are no Nakal tablets, no Mu-style architecture, no artifacts that can be traced to this supposed motherland. The absence of evidence in this case is strong evidence of absence. Churchward's reliance on ancient texts and sacred scriptures as evidence for Mu is equally problematic. He claimed that references in the Hindu epic Ramayana to the Nakals, coming to Burma from the land of their birth in the east, were proof that the Nakals came from Mu in the Pacific. But the east is a relative direction that depends on where you're standing, and the passage Churchward cited can be interpreted in many different ways that don't involve a lost continent. Similarly, his attempts to find references to Mu in the Bible, the Popol Vuh of the Maya, and other religious texts involved highly speculative translations and interpretations that mainstream scholars do not accept. Religious texts are rarely straightforward historical records. They're complex documents that blend mythology, moral teaching, ritual instruction, and sometimes genuine historical memory, all filtered through the lens of the culture that produced them. The Troano manuscript, which both Augustus Luplongeon and Churchward cited as key evidence, provides a perfect example of how misinterpretation can lead to entirely false conclusions. This document, now known as the Madrid Codex, is indeed a genuine pre-Columbian Mayan book, one of only 4 such books known to have survived the Spanish conquest. However, the attempt to translate it using the de Landa alphabet was fundamentally flawed. Diego de Landa was a Spanish bishop in the 16th century who recorded some information about Mayan culture, including what he thought was an alphabet. But Mayan writing is not alphabetic. It's a complex system that combines phonetic elements with logograms, symbols representing whole words. De Landa's alphabet was actually a list of syllables and sounds that Mayan scribes gave him when he asked how to write Spanish letters, not a key to Mayan writing itself. Using it to translate Mayan texts is like trying to use Chinese characters to write English. It produces nonsense. When modern epigraphers finally succeeded in deciphering Mayan writing in the 20th century, using proper linguistic methods, they found that the Madrid Codex contains information about rituals, astronomical calculations, and agricultural calendars. There is no mention of any land called Mu, no reference to a lost continent, no story of refugees or catastrophes that matches Churchward's narrative. The Mu that Brasser and Luplongeon thought they found was simply a misreading of symbols that had entirely different meanings. This is a sobering reminder of how easy it is to see what we want to see in ambiguous or poorly understood evidence, and how important it is to use rigorous methods rather than imagination when trying to understand the past. Despite all these problems, Churchward's books continue to sell and find believers. Part of the reason is that he presented his evidence with tremendous confidence, writing as though these were established facts rather than wild speculations. He included illustrations, charts, and maps that gave his claims an aura of scholarly authority. And he tapped into a deep human tendency to find patterns and connections, to see order and meaning where there may be only randomness. We want to believe that the ancient world holds secrets, that there is wisdom we've forgotten, that the similarities we observe between cultures have profound significance. Churchward offered people a way to believe these things, even if the foundation was built on sand rather than solid rock. While James Churchward was writing his books about Mu and finding an enthusiastic popular audience, geology as a science was undergoing a revolution that would make the existence of Mu utterly impossible according to our understanding of how the Earth actually works. This revolution was the acceptance of plate tectonics and continental drift, theories that explain how continents move, how oceans form, and why the Earth's surface looks the way it does. Understanding these geological principles is essential to understanding why scientists reject the Mu hypothesis. Not because they're closed-minded or suppressing hidden knowledge, but because Mu contradicts fundamental, well-established facts about the planet we live on. The story of plate tectonics begins in the early 20th century with a German scientist named Alfred Wegener. In 1912, Wegener proposed a radical idea that the continents were not fixed in place but actually moved slowly across the surface of the Earth. He pointed out that the coastlines of South America and Africa appeared to fit together like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle, suggesting they had once been joined. He noted that fossils of the same ancient plants and animals could be found on continents now separated by vast oceans, implying those continents must have once been connected. He documented geological features, mountain ranges, rock formations, coal deposits, that lined up perfectly when the continents were placed together in their hypothetical ancient positions. Wegener called his idea continental drift, and he proposed that all the continents had once formed a single supercontinent, which he named Pangaea, meaning all Earth. According to his theory, Pangaea began to break apart around 200 million years ago, and the fragments drifted apart to become the continents we know today. This was an elegant explanation for many puzzling observations, but Wegener faced tremendous skepticism from the scientific community of his time. The main criticism was that he couldn't explain what force could possibly be powerful enough to move entire continents across the Earth's surface. His ideas were mostly rejected during his lifetime, and he died in 1930 while on an expedition to Greenland, still trying to gather more evidence for continental drift. However, Wegener was essentially correct, and in the decades following his death, evidence accumulated that vindicated his hypothesis. Crucial breakthroughs came from studying the ocean floors. After World War II, when sonar and other technologies made it possible to map the underwater topography of the oceans, scientists discovered enormous underwater mountain ranges, called mid-ocean ridges, running through the Atlantic, Pacific, and Indian Oceans. Even more intriguingly, they found that the rocks on the ocean floor showed a pattern of magnetic stripes running parallel to these ridges. The Earth's magnetic field has reversed many times throughout history, with north and south magnetic poles switching places. As new rock forms at mid-ocean ridges, it records the direction of the magnetic field at that time, creating a striped pattern as the seafloor spreads outward from the ridge. This discovery led to the development of the theory of plate tectonics in the 1960s. Plate tectonics builds on Wegener's idea of continental drift but provides the mechanism that Wegener lacked. The Earth's outer layer, called the lithosphere, is not a single solid shell but rather a mosaic of large plates, some carrying continents and some forming ocean floors. These plates float on the more fluid asthenosphere beneath them, and they move in response to convection currents in the Earth's mantle. At mid-ocean ridges, new crust is continuously formed as magma rises from below, pushing the plates apart. At subduction zones, one plate slides beneath another, returning old crust to the mantle. At transform boundaries, plates slide past each other horizontally, sometimes getting stuck and then suddenly releasing in powerful earthquakes. The theory of plate tectonics has been confirmed by countless observations and measurements. We can now directly measure the movement of continents using GPS satellites, which detect shifts of a few centimeters per year, about the same rate at which your fingernails grow. We can date the age of ocean floor rocks and show that they get progressively older as you move away from mid-ocean ridges, exactly as predicted. We can explain the distribution of earthquakes and volcanoes as occurring primarily along plate boundaries. We can reconstruct the past positions of continents and show how mountain ranges like the Himalayas formed when tectonic plates collided. Plate tectonics is now as well established as any theory in science, as solid as the theory of evolution or the germ theory of disease. And this is where the hypothesis of Mu runs into an insurmountable problem. According to plate tectonic theory, continents are made of relatively light rocks, primarily granite and similar materials, which float on the denser rocks of the oceanic crust and mantle. This is why continents stand high above the ocean floor. They're like icebergs, most of their mass is below the surface, but they're buoyant enough to stay at the top. The Pacific Ocean floor, on the other hand, is made of basalt and similar dense volcanic rocks. It is geologically young. The oldest parts of the Pacific floor are only about 200 million years old, and most of it is much younger than that, continuously being created at mid-ocean ridges and destroyed at subduction zones. There is simply no way for a continent the size Churchward described to exist in the Pacific and then sink without a trace. Continents don't sink, they're too light. They can be submerged by rising sea levels, as happened at the end of the Ice Age when melting glaciers caused oceans to rise by several hundred feet, drowning coastal areas and creating the shallow seas that now cover what were once dry land connections between islands. But a large continent cannot simply drop into the ocean and disappear, especially not in the span of a single night or even a few days. The geological processes that could lower a large landmass operate over millions of years, not hours. And if such a continent had existed and then broken up, we would find its fragments. Chunks of continental crust that didn't sink but remained as islands, seamounts, or underwater plateaus. The Pacific Ocean has been thoroughly mapped, and no such evidence exists. Some modern proponents of Mu have pointed to the Emperor Seamount chain or other underwater features as possible remnants of the lost continent, but these interpretations don't hold up to scrutiny. The Emperor Seamounts are indeed an impressive chain of underwater mountains, but they are volcanic in origin, formed as the Pacific Plate moved over a mantle hotspot, like a conveyor belt passing over a fixed flame. They are made of basalt, not the granite that makes up continents, and their ages fit perfectly with the expected pattern from plate tectonics. They're no more remnants of Mu than the Hawaiian Islands, which are part of the same hotspot chain, are lost fragments of Atlantis. The Hawaiian Islands themselves deserve special mention, because they are often cited by Mu enthusiasts as mountain peaks of the lost continent. Hawaii is indeed volcanic, with tall mountains rising from the ocean floor, and it's easy to imagine these as peaks that once were part of a larger landmass. But geology tells us a very different story. The Hawaiian Islands are young. The oldest of the main islands, Kauai, is only about 5 million years old, and the big island of Hawaii itself is less than 500,000 years old and is still actively growing as lava flows add new land. These islands formed from volcanic activity as the Pacific Plate moved over the Hawaiian hotspot, and they will eventually be carried away from the hotspot by the plate's motion, cease their volcanic activity, and slowly erode away. They were never part of a larger continent, because no such continent ever existed in this part of the Pacific. Easter Island, another key location in the Moon mythology, also has a volcanic origin and is relatively young in geological terms. It sits on the Nazca Plate, far from any continental landmass, and formed from hotspot volcanism around 3 million years ago. The island is made entirely of basaltic lava, with no trace of the granitic rocks that would indicate a continental origin. Archaeological evidence shows that humans first reached Easter Island around 1300 in the Common Era, making it one of the last places on Earth to be colonized by people. There is no indication that the island was ever larger or that it was part of a more extensive land area that subsequently sank. It has always been a small, isolated island, though it was once more heavily forested before the Rapa Nui people cleared much of the vegetation. Similar arguments apply to all the other Pacific islands that have been proposed as remnants of Mu. The Marquesas, Tahiti, Fiji, Samoa, the Marshall Islands, Kiribati. All of these are either volcanic islands formed by hot spots or atolls built up from coral reefs growing on the rims of sunken volcanoes. They are young in geological terms, they are made of volcanic rocks or coral, and they show no evidence of ever having been part of a larger landmass. The Pacific Ocean is exactly what plate tectonics predicts it should be. A large ocean basin with a geologically young floor, dotted with volcanic islands formed by hot spots and subduction zone activity, bounded by subduction zones around its edges, the Ring of Fire, where earthquakes and volcanoes are common. There is no room in this picture for a vast sunken continent. What about the various flood myths and legends that Churchward cited as evidence for Mu's destruction? These are real. Nearly every culture in the world has some story of a great flood that destroyed an earlier world. But they don't require a lost continent to explain them. Many of these myths may preserve memories of real floods, but local or regional ones, not global catastrophes. The Black Sea, for instance, was once a freshwater lake that was suddenly flooded by seawater from the Mediterranean around 7,500 years ago when rising sea levels breached the land barrier. That's been a traumatic event for people living around the Black Sea at the time, and it's been proposed as a possible historical basis for flood myths in that region. Similarly, the end of the Ice Age saw dramatic sea level rises that would have forced coastal communities to relocate, sometimes rapidly. Tsunami events caused by earthquakes and volcanic eruptions also periodically devastate coastal areas, and these could be remembered and mythologized in oral traditions. The biblical flood story, which Churchward tried to connect to Mu, is now understood by scholars to be related to Mesopotamian flood myths, particularly the story in the Epic of Gilgamesh, which dates back to at least 1800 years before the Common Era and possibly earlier. These Near Eastern flood stories may reflect historical floods of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, which periodically inundated the flat plains of Mesopotamia, or they may serve symbolic and religious purposes rather than being historical records. Either way, they don't require a Pacific Ocean continent to explain them. The global distribution of flood myths is better explained by the universal importance of water to human societies and the universal threat that floods pose. combined with the fact that many early civilizations developed along rivers and coasts where flooding was a regular occurrence. In short, modern geology provides no support whatsoever for the existence of Mu. The mechanisms by which continents form, move, and persist are now well understood, and they exclude the possibility of a large continental landmass in the Pacific that could have existed as recently as 12,000 years ago and then sunk beneath the ocean. The rocks of the Pacific Ocean floor, the structure of the ocean basins, the distribution and ages of islands, the patterns of earthquakes and volcanoes, all of this evidence tells a coherent story that has no place for Mu in it. This isn't because scientists are biased against the idea or are suppressing evidence. It's simply that the idea contradicts fundamental facts about how the Earth works. Facts that have been confirmed by multiple independent lines of evidence and that form the foundation of an entire scientific discipline. This presents a significant challenge for anyone who wants to believe in Mu. They must either reject the entire science of geology, which would mean throwing out vast amounts of knowledge about the Earth that has practical applications and has been repeatedly confirmed, or they must find a way to reinterpret the Mu story so that it doesn't conflict with geological reality. Some modern believers have tried the latter approach, suggesting that Mu wasn't really a continent but rather a chain of large islands, or that it was located somewhere else, or that it existed in a much more distant past before the current configuration of the Pacific Ocean formed. But these reinterpretations require abandoning most of what Churchward claimed, at which point one has to ask, if we're changing the story so drastically, is it still meaningful to call it Mu, or have we just created a new myth using the name of the old one? While James Churchward was writing his books about Mu and finding an enthusiastic popular audience, geology as a science was undergoing a revolution that would make the existence of Mu utterly impossible according to our understanding of how the Earth actually works. This revolution was the acceptance of plate tectonics and continental drift, theories that explain how continents move, how oceans form, and why the Earth's surface looks the way it does. Understanding these geological principles is essential to understanding why scientists reject the Mu hypothesis, not because they're closed-minded or suppressing hidden knowledge, but because Mu contradicts fundamental, well-established facts about the planet we live on. The story of plate tectonics begins in the early 20th century with a German scientist named Alfred Wegener. In 1912, Wegener proposed a radical idea, that the continents were not fixed in place but actually moved slowly across the surface of the Earth. He pointed out that the coastlines of South America and Africa appeared to fit together like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle, suggesting they had once been joined. He noted that fossils of the same ancient plants and animals could be found on continents now separated by vast oceans, implying those continents must have once been connected. He documented geological features, mountain ranges, rock formations, coal deposits, that lined up perfectly when the continents were placed together in their hypothetical ancient positions. Wegener called his idea continental drift, and he proposed that all the continents had once formed a single supercontinent, which he named Pangaea, meaning all Earth. According to his theory, Pangaea began to break apart around 200 million years ago, and the fragments drifted apart to become the continents we know today. This was an elegant explanation for many puzzling observations, but Wegener faced tremendous skepticism from the scientific community of his time. The main criticism was that he couldn't explain what force could possibly be powerful enough to move entire continents across the Earth's surface. His ideas were mostly rejected during his lifetime, and he died in 1930 while on an expedition to Greenland, still trying to gather more evidence for continental drift. However, Wegener was essentially correct, and in the decades following his death, evidence accumulated that vindicated his hypothesis. Crucial breakthroughs came from studying the ocean floors. After World War II, when sonar and other technologies made it possible to map the underwater topography of the oceans, scientists discovered enormous underwater mountain ranges, called mid-ocean ridges, running through the Atlantic, Pacific, and Indian Oceans. Even more intriguingly, they found that the rocks on the ocean floor showed a pattern of magnetic stripes running parallel to these ridges. The Earth's magnetic field has reversed many times throughout history, with north and south magnetic poles switching places. As new rock forms at mid-ocean ridges, it records the direction of the magnetic field at that time, creating a striped pattern as the seafloor spreads outward from the ridge. This discovery led to the development of the theory of plate tectonics in the 1960s. Plate tectonics builds on Wegener's idea of continental drift but provides the mechanism that Wegener lacked. The Earth's outer layer, called the lithosphere, is not a single solid shell but rather a mosaic of large plates, some carrying continents and some forming ocean floors. These plates float on the more fluid asthenosphere beneath them, and they move in response to convection currents in the Earth's mantle. At mid-ocean ridges, new crust is continuously formed as magma rises from below, pushing the plates apart. At subduction zones, one plate slides beneath another, returning old crust to the mantle. At transform boundaries, plates slide past each other horizontally, sometimes getting stuck and then suddenly releasing in powerful earthquakes. The theory of plate tectonics has been confirmed by countless observations and measurements. We can now directly measure the movement of continents using GPS satellites, which detect shifts of a few centimeters per year, about the same rate at which your fingernails grow. We can date the age of ocean floor rocks and show that they get progressively older as you move away from mid-ocean ridges, exactly as predicted. We can explain the distribution of earthquakes and volcanoes as occurring primarily along plate boundaries. We can reconstruct the past positions of continents and show how mountain ranges like the Himalayas formed when tectonic plates collided. Plate tectonics is now as well established as any theory in science, as solid as the theory of evolution or the germ theory of disease. And this is where the hypothesis of Mu runs into an insurmountable problem. According to plate tectonic theory, continents are made of relatively light rocks, primarily granite and similar materials, which float on the denser rocks of the oceanic crust and mantle. This is why continents stand high above the ocean floor. They're like icebergs, most of their mass is below the surface, but they're buoyant enough to stay at the top. The Pacific Ocean floor, on the other hand, is made of basalt and similar dense volcanic rocks. It is geologically young. The oldest parts of the Pacific floor are only about 200 million years old, and most of it is much younger than that, continuously being created at mid-ocean ridges and destroyed at subduction zones. There is simply no way for a continent the size Churchward described to exist in the Pacific and then sink without a trace. Continents don't sink, they're too light. They can be submerged by rising sea levels, as happened at the end of the Ice Age when melting glaciers caused oceans to rise by several hundred feet, drowning coastal areas and creating the shallow seas that now cover what were once dry land connections between islands. But a large continent cannot simply drop into the ocean and disappear, especially not in the span of a single night or even a few days. The geological processes that could lower a large landmass operate over millions of years, not hours. And if such a continent had existed and then broken up, we would find its fragments, chunks of continental crust that didn't sink but remained as islands, seamounts, or underwater plateaus. The Pacific Ocean has been thoroughly mapped, and no such evidence exists. Some modern proponents of Mu have pointed to the Emperor Seamount chain or other underwater features as possible remnants of the lost continent, but these interpretations don't hold up to scrutiny. The Emperor Seamounts are indeed an impressive chain of underwater mountains, but they are volcanic in origin, formed as the Pacific Plate moved over a mantle hot spot, like a conveyor belt passing over a fixed flame. They are made of basalt, not the granite that makes up continents, and their ages fit perfectly with the expected pattern from plate tectonics. There are no more remnants of Mu than the Hawaiian Islands, which are part of the same hotspot chain, are lost fragments of Atlantis. The appeal of lost continents and ancient civilizations also ties into what might be called the mystery of origins. Humans are deeply concerned with questions of where we came from and how we got here. Our origin stories, whether religious, mythological, or scientific, help define who we are and give meaning to our existence. The standard narrative provided by science, that humanity evolved gradually from earlier primates, that civilizations developed independently in different regions as agriculture allowed for settled communities, that progress has been slow and incremental with much trial and error, is in some ways unsatisfying. It's messy, it's complicated, and it doesn't have a clear beginning or a dramatic narrative arc. The Mu story, by contrast, provides a neat origin point. All civilizations came from this one mother culture. All knowledge ultimately derives from this single source. All of humanity shares a common heritage that goes back to a time before recorded history. It simplifies a complex reality into a story that's easier to grasp and more emotionally satisfying. There's also a political dimension to the appeal of lost continent theories that shouldn't be overlooked. Throughout history, these theories have sometimes been used to advance ideological agendas. In understanding this helps explain both their appeal and the dangers they pose. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, when theories about Atlantis, Lemuria, and Mu were flourishing, Europe and America were in the grip of racial pseudoscience. Theorists classified humans into racial categories and ranked these races in hierarchies, with Europeans typically placed at the top as supposedly the most advanced. These racial theories were used to justify colonialism, slavery, and other forms of oppression and exploitation. Churchwards claimed that the people of Mu were a white race or melanated race, that had brought civilization to other parts of the world fit into these ideologies, suggesting that non-European peoples had achieved their accomplishments not through their own abilities but through instruction from this superior ancient race. The flip side of this was that colonized and oppressed peoples sometimes embraced lost continent theories as a way of reclaiming their own histories and asserting their dignity. The concept of Lemuria, for instance, was adopted by some in the Tamil community in southern India as the location of an ancient Tamil civilization that predated all others. This wasn't based on solid evidence any more than Churchward's Mu was, but it served a psychological and political purpose. It countered British colonial narratives that portrayed Indian civilization as primitive or backward by asserting that Indians, or at least Tamils, had an ancient and glorious past. Similarly, some in the African American community have embraced theories about Atlantis or other lost African civilizations as a way of countering racist narratives about African history. While these uses of lost continent theories are more sympathetic than Churchward's racialized version, they still rely on pseudo-history rather than actual evidence, and mainstream scholars argue that they ultimately do a disservice to the real achievements of the cultures in question. It's worth noting that the persistence of belief in Mu and similar lost continents is not simply a matter of ignorance or lack of education. Polls have shown that significant percentages of Americans, Europeans, and people in other developed countries believe in various fringe theories about the ancient past, despite having access to good information about what scholars actually know. Part of this is due to the role of media. Television shows like Ancient Aliens, and documentaries that present pseudo-archaeological theories alongside or instead of mainstream scientific evidence reach large audiences and shape popular perceptions. The entertainment value of these programs is high because they offer mystery, adventure, and the thrill of supposed hidden knowledge. By contrast, genuine archaeology can seem less exciting, involving as it does careful documentation of pottery shards, analysis of pollen samples, and incremental accumulation of knowledge. The truth is often less dramatic than the myth. There's also an element of distrust of authority and institutions at work. In an era when many people feel that governments, corporations, and academic institutions don't have their best interests at heart, alternative histories and conspiracy theories about suppressed knowledge can seem plausible. Why should we trust what mainstream scholars tell us, some ask, when they might be wrong or might be hiding the truth? The problem with this reasoning is that it conflates healthy skepticism with blanket rejection of expertise. Scientists and scholars certainly can be wrong, and they do sometimes make mistakes or resist new ideas. But the scientific method is specifically designed to correct errors through peer review, replication, and accumulation of evidence. Pseudo-archaeology, by contrast, is not self-correcting. It tends to accumulate errors and false claims that are never properly addressed because there's no mechanism for rigorous testing and revision. Ultimately, the psychological appeal of lost continents like Mu rests on a complex mix of factors. The desire for a golden age, the tendency to see patterns, confirmation bias, the attraction of secret knowledge, the search for origins, and sometimes political or ideological motivations. These are powerful forces, which is why the legend of Mu has endured for nearly a century despite being thoroughly debunked by geology, archaeology, and other sciences. Recognizing these psychological factors doesn't make someone who believes in Mu foolish or gullible. It makes them human, subject to the same cognitive biases and emotional needs that we all share. But it does mean that critical thinking and evidence-based reasoning are essential if we want to understand the real history of our planet and our species, rather than comforting or exciting myths. Another significant factor in the endurance of the Mu legend is what psychologists call cognitive dissonance and the backfire effect. When people have invested significant time, energy, or emotion into a belief, being confronted with evidence against that belief can actually strengthen their conviction rather than weaken it. This happens because admitting we were wrong about something important feels threatening to our self-image and sense of competence. It's psychologically easier to dismiss the contrary evidence or to find reasons why it doesn't apply than to undergo the uncomfortable process of changing our minds. This is especially true when a belief has become part of our identity or when we've shared it publicly with others. The social cost of admitting error can seem too high. For someone who has spent years studying Churchward's books, attending lectures about Mu, perhaps even traveling to Pacific Islands in search of evidence, being told by scientists that Mu never existed isn't just an intellectual challenge. It's a challenge to their entire framework of understanding, to relationships they've built with like-minded believers, to investments of time and resources they've made. The psychological resistance to accepting such information is understandable, even if it's ultimately counterproductive. This is why debunking efforts often fail to convince true believers. They're not just presenting information, they're asking people to give up something that has become meaningful to them. The role of narrative coherence in belief systems also shouldn't be underestimated. The Mu story, as told by Churchward and elaborated by later writers, is a complete, satisfying narrative with a beginning, middle, and end. It explains the rise of a great civilization, its golden age, and its tragic destruction. It accounts for similarities between cultures, provides an origin story for humanity, and offers moral lessons about hubris, environmental catastrophe, and the fragility of civilization. This narrative completeness makes it feel true in a way that the piecemeal, constantly revised nature of scientific knowledge often doesn't. Scientific accounts of human history are always provisional, always subject to revision as new evidence emerges, always filled with gaps and uncertainties. The Mu story, by contrast, has a pleasing certainty and coherence, even if that certainty is false. There's also a generational aspect to consider. For many people who first encountered the Mu story in their youth, perhaps through their parents or grandparents who read Churchward's books when they were first published, the legend has nostalgic associations. It's connected to memories of wonder and discovery, of being introduced to big ideas about the world. Letting go of the story can feel like losing something from childhood, like growing up and losing innocence. This emotional dimension means that arguments based purely on geological or archaeological evidence may never be entirely persuasive, because they're addressing intellectual claims while ignoring the emotional reality of what the belief means to the person holding it. The intersection of Mu belief with broader cultural anxieties about modernity and progress is also worth examining. In an age of rapid technological change, environmental degradation, and social upheaval, the story of Mu offers a kind of cautionary tale. It suggests that even the most advanced civilizations can fall, that progress is not guaranteed, that we might lose everything we've built. For some, this serves as a warning that we should take seriously. We need to be mindful of how we treat the planet, how we use our technology, how we organize our societies, because the fate of Mu could be our fate. This interpretation gives the myth a modern relevance that transcends questions of historical accuracy. Whether or not Mu actually existed, the story can still function as a parable about environmental stewardship and the dangers of unchecked technological development. Some psychologists and anthropologists have suggested that myths of lost golden ages serve a regulatory function in societies, providing a reference point against which to measure current conditions and behaviors. By imagining a past civilization that was wiser, more harmonious, and more advanced in certain ways, we create an ideal to strive toward. This can be motivating even if the ideal itself is fictional. The problem comes when fictional ideals are mistaken for historical reality, because that can lead to false conclusions about what's possible or what's required to achieve a better society. If we think Mu's achievements were real, we might waste time trying to rediscover their supposed secrets rather than developing our own solutions to contemporary problems. But if we understand Mu as an aspirational myth rather than a historical fact, it can potentially serve a useful function in articulating values and goals. The gender dynamics of lost continent myths also merit attention. Churchward's Mu, like Plato's Atlantis, was presented as a patriarchal society with a male king and a male priestly hierarchy. However, later reinterpretations, particularly in New Age contexts, have sometimes reimagined Lemuria/Mu as a matriarchal or gender egalitarian society, emphasizing feminine or maternal aspects of the lost continent. The name Motherland itself evokes feminine imagery, and some spiritual teachers describe Lemuria as representing a feminine principle of intuition, emotion, and connection to nature, in contrast to the more masculine, rational, technological aspects often attributed to Atlantis. These reinterpretations reflect contemporary concerns about gender roles and the desire to imagine alternative social structures. They also demonstrate how myths are continually reshaped to serve the needs of each generation. Despite its complete lack of scientific validity, the legend of Mu has left a significant mark on popular culture, inspiring countless works of fiction, influencing spiritual movements, and continuing to captivate imaginations more than a century after James Churchward first popularized the idea. The story of Mu has proven to be remarkably adaptable, taking on new forms and meanings as it has been reinterpreted by successive generations of writers, mystics, and enthusiasts. Understanding this cultural legacy helps us see how myths function in modern society and why some ideas persist long after they've been discredited by science. In the realm of literature, Mu has appeared in numerous works of speculative fiction and fantasy. Perhaps the most famous literary treatment comes from H.P. Lovecraft, the influential horror writer who incorporated Mu into his elaborate fictional mythology. In Lovecraft's stories, particularly those that form what's called the Cthulhu mythos, Mu appears as one of several lost civilizations that existed on Earth in the distant past, before the rise of modern humanity. These ancient cities were inhabited by powerful beings, some godlike entities, some monstrous creatures, that wielded incredible power and knowledge. In Lovecraft's 1935 story, Out of the Eons, written in collaboration with Hazel Heald, the sunken continent of Mu plays a central role in a tale of ancient horror awakening in the modern world. Lovecraft's version of Mu is far darker than Churchward's idealized motherland. It's a place of alien geometries, forbidden knowledge, and cosmic terror. Lovecraft's friend and correspondent Robert E. Howard, creator of Conan the Barbarian, also incorporated elements of lost continents into his stories, though he more often wrote about Atlantis and Lemuria than Mu specifically. The influence runs in both directions. Churchward's work inspired these writers, and their stories in turn helped keep the idea of lost continents in the public imagination. Lynn Carter, another writer in the Lovecraftian tradition, developed what he called the Zothic legend cycle, which featured Mu prominently. Through these and other works of pulp fiction, science fiction, and fantasy, Mu became part of the shared vocabulary of speculative literature, a standard element in stories about ancient mysteries and hidden histories. The influence of Mu extends beyond horror and fantasy into other genres as well. Adventure novels, historical fiction with speculative elements, and even some works ostensibly presented as non-fiction have drawn on Churchward's ideas or elaborated on them. In 1970, a humorous book titled Mu Revealed by Tony Earl claimed to present translations of a diary kept by a boy for Mu just before the continent's destruction. The book was actually a spoof, written by Raymond Buckland under a pseudonym that was an anagram of Not Really, but some readers took it seriously, demonstrating how the line between fiction and pseudo-history can become blurred. The character name Cland was borrowed from Churchward, and Reed's son Herdlop, the fictional archaeologist who supposedly discovered and translated the diary, was an anagram of Rudolph Rednose, hints that the whole thing was a joke. Yet the book found an audience and continues to be cited occasionally by those unaware of its satirical nature. Mu has also made its way into comic books, graphic novels, and animation. Japanese manga and anime have occasionally featured the lost continent, sometimes blending it with other legendary lands like Atlantis or Lemuria. Video games have used Mu as a setting or as background lore, most notably in games that deal with ancient civilizations or apocalyptic events. The Star Ocean series of role-playing games, for instance, features Mu as the lost homeworld of ancient beings. These appearances in games and visual media introduced the concept of Mu to new generations who may have never read Churchward's books or even heard of them outside these fictional contexts. In this way, Mu becomes a self-perpetuating myth. People encounter it in stories, become intrigued by the concept, and go looking for more information, which leads them to Churchward's work or to modern websites and books about lost continents. The New Age movement has embraced Mu enthusiastically, often conflating it with Lemuria and integrating both into a complex spiritual cosmology. In New Age thought, Mu/Lemuria is often portrayed as a highly evolved spiritual civilization whose inhabitants had developed their consciousness to a degree far beyond what modern humans have achieved. These ancient people supposedly possessed psychic abilities, could communicate telepathically, had access to higher dimensions of reality, and lived in harmony with nature and cosmic forces. According to these beliefs, when Mu was destroyed, the souls of its inhabitants were scattered, but they continued to reincarnate in the present day. People who feel drawn to the story of Mu or who report past life memories of living there are said to be former Lemurians, carrying with them some trace of that ancient civilization's spiritual knowledge. This spiritual interpretation of Mu serves a very different purpose than Churchward's original pseudo-historical narrative. For New Age practitioners, Mu is less about physical geography or archaeological evidence and more about spiritual evolution and consciousness. The story becomes a metaphor for human potential. If our ancestors could achieve such high levels of spiritual development, then so can we. The destruction of Mu is interpreted not just as a geological catastrophe but as a spiritual lesson, perhaps about the dangers of misusing power or losing touch with higher wisdom. Some New Age teachers claim to channel messages from Lemurian or Moon Masters, spirit guides who exist in non-physical realms and offer guidance to seekers today. Workshops, retreats, and meditation practices centered on connecting with Lemurian/Mu energy or recovering past life memories from the lost continent have become part of the New Age landscape. Certain locations have become associated with this spiritual version of Mu. Mount Shasta in Northern California is particularly significant in New Age lore. Some believers claim that a remnant population from Mu/Lemuria survived the destruction of their continent and eventually made their way to Mount Shasta, where they established an underground or hidden city. This city, sometimes called Telos, is said to be inhabited by the descendants of the Lemurians, who have advanced technology and spiritual knowledge and occasionally interact with surface dwellers. Visitors to Mount Shasta have reported various unusual experiences: strange lights, mysterious sounds, encounters with unusual beings, which believers interpret as evidence of the hidden Lemurian presence. The area has attracted a community of New Age seekers and spiritual practitioners who feel drawn to what they perceive as the mountain's special energy. Hawaii has also been claimed as a location connected to Mu. Some versions of the legend suggest that the Hawaiian Islands were among the mountain peaks of Mu that remained above water after the rest of the continent sank, or that Hawaiian culture preserved traditions and knowledge passed down from the lost civilization. Indigenous Hawaiians generally do not accept these interpretations, which are imposed on their culture from outside, but the association persists in New Age and alternative history circles. Tours and workshops in Hawaii sometimes incorporate references to Mu or Lemuria, offering participants the chance to connect with the supposedly ancient energies of the place. This commodification of the myth, turning it into a tourist attraction and spiritual product, represents another transformation of Churchward's original idea. The persistence of belief in Mu in certain communities, despite scientific debunking, raises interesting questions about the sociology of knowledge and belief. Why do some people continue to accept ideas that mainstream scholarship rejects? Part of the answer lies in the structure of communities of belief. People who are interested in lost continents, ancient mysteries, and alternative histories often form social networks where these ideas are shared, discussed, and reinforced. Websites, forums, conferences, and social media groups provide spaces where believers can connect with like-minded individuals. Within these communities, alternative sources of information, books by fringe authors, documentaries presenting pseudo-archaeological theories, YouTube videos by amateur researchers, are valued more highly than peer-reviewed academic publications. The community develops its own authorities, its own standards of evidence, and its own narrative about why mainstream scholars reject their ideas: suppression, closed-mindedness, attachment to outdated paradigms, etc. This creates what scholars call an epistemic bubble or echo chamber, where the members of the community are exposed primarily to information that confirms their beliefs and are shielded from effective criticism. When someone from outside the community, a scientist, a skeptic, a journalist, presents evidence against Mu, it can be dismissed as coming from someone who is either ignorant of the real evidence or who has some motive to suppress the truth. The community thus becomes self-reinforcing, and beliefs become entrenched even in the face of contrary evidence. This is not unique to belief in Mu. Similar dynamics can be observed in many fringe movements, conspiracy theory communities, and alternative belief systems. The internet has amplified this effect. Before the internet, someone interested in Mu would have to seek out Churchward's books, might have trouble finding them, and would have limited opportunities to discuss these ideas with others who shared their interest. Now, a simple search will turn up thousands of websites, videos, and forum discussions about Mu. The signal-to-noise ratio is poor. Much of what's online about Mu is nonsense, misinformation, or wild speculation. But the sheer volume of material can make it seem as though there's a substantial body of evidence supporting the idea. And because anyone can publish online, there's no quality control, no editorial oversight, and no requirement that claims be backed up with reliable evidence. This democratization of information has positive aspects, but it also means that fringe theories can flourish and find audiences much more easily than in the past. Interestingly, some modern proponents of Mu have attempted to reconcile the myth with scientific discoveries, creating hybrid narratives that maintain some elements of Churchward's vision while acknowledging that a literal Pacific continent is geologically impossible. One such attempt involves pointing to the microcontinent of Zealandia, a large area of continental crust that is mostly submerged beneath the Pacific Ocean near New Zealand. Zealandia is a real geological feature, and it is indeed a continent by certain definitions, though most of it is underwater. However, Zealandia sank, or more accurately, subsided beneath sea level, gradually over millions of years as tectonic forces stretched and thinned the crust. It was never home to any human civilization, as it was fully submerged long before humans evolved, and it's in the wrong part of the Pacific to match Churchward's description of Mu. Nevertheless, some enthusiasts have suggested that the memory of Zealandia's subsidence might have been preserved in myths and legends, or that Churchward's account of Mu might be a garbled memory of this real geological feature. Other attempts to salvage the Mu story involve reinterpreting it as referring to a network of large islands rather than a true continent, or moving its location to somewhere other than the Pacific. But these reinterpretations require abandoning so much of what Churchward claimed that it's questionable whether the result can still be called Mu in any meaningful sense. It's a bit like trying to save the story of Santa Claus by saying that there was once a generous person named Nicholas who lived in Turkey. Technically true, but the real Saint Nicholas bears little resemblance to the mythical Santa Claus of modern tradition. At some point, a myth that has been sufficiently altered stops being the same myth and becomes something new. The cultural legacy of Mu is thus complex and multifaceted. It includes genuine literary works that use the lost continent as a setting for storytelling, New Age spiritual movements that have transformed the myth into a narrative about consciousness and human potential, communities of believers who maintain that Churchward was essentially correct, and even commercial ventures that exploit the romance and mystery of the lost continent for tourism and entertainment. In all these forms, Mu continues to have a presence in modern culture, even though it never had any presence in actual history. This raises interesting questions about the relationship between myth and reality, between what we know and what we want to believe, and between the stories we tell ourselves about the past and the actual evidence that archaeology and geology provide. As we reach the conclusion of this exploration of the legend of Mu, it's worth stepping back to consider what this entire story tells us about human nature, about how we create meaning, and about the tension between scientific understanding and mythological thinking. The lost continent of Mu, as envisioned by James Churchward, never existed. This is not a controversial statement among geologists, archaeologists, and other scientists who study the Earth and human history. The evidence against Mu is overwhelming, coming from multiple independent disciplines, and there is no serious scientific debate about whether the continent was real. And yet the story persists, adapted and reinterpreted but never entirely forgotten. What? Part of the answer is that Mu, like Atlantis and Lemuria and other legendary lost lands, serves functions that have nothing to do with historical or geological accuracy. These stories are myths in the deepest sense of the word, not lies or delusions, but narratives that express truths about human experience, values, and aspirations, even if they don't describe historical events. The myth of Mu speaks to our sense of wonder about the past, our desire to believe that our ancestors might have achieved things we can barely imagine, our hope that there is wisdom we've lost that might be recovered. It gives form to our anxieties about catastrophe and change, our fear that what we've built could be swept away in an instant by forces beyond our control. And it provides a narrative of human unity and common origin, suggesting that beneath all our differences, we share a heritage that links us together. In comparing Mu to its sister legends of Atlantis and Lemuria, we can see both common patterns and interesting variations. Atlantis, as described by Plato in the 4th century before the Common Era, is the oldest of these lost continent myths, though it's important to note that for most of history, Plato's story was understood as an allegory, a moral tale about the dangers of hubris and the fall of empires, rather than as a historical account. It wasn't until the 19th century, with writers like Ignatius Donnelly, that Atlantis was reinterpreted as a literal lost continent. Donnelly's 1882 book, Atlantis, The Antediluvian World, portrayed Atlantis as a real place, an advanced civilization that had been destroyed by catastrophe, and he argued that survivors from Atlantis had founded the civilizations of Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the Americas. This was essentially the same narrative that Augustus Lupulungen and later James Churchward would apply to Mu, with the main difference being the location: Atlantis in the Atlantic Ocean, Mu in the Pacific. Lemuria, as we've seen, began as a legitimate scientific hypothesis proposed by Philip Sclater in 1864 to explain the distribution of lemurs in Madagascar and India. When that hypothesis was superseded by better geological theories, Lemuria should have been abandoned. Instead, it was adopted by the Theosophical movement, led by Helena Blavatsky, and transformed into an occult mystery, the home of the third root race of humanity, a civilization of spiritually advanced beings who lived millions of years ago. In this form, Lemuria became confused and conflated with Mu, particularly in New Age thought, where the two names are often used interchangeably. Some accounts try to distinguish them, for instance placing Lemuria in the Indian Ocean and Mu in the Pacific, but the details vary widely depending on who's telling the story. What all three myths have in common is that they emerged or were reinterpreted during a particular historical period, the late 19th and early 20th centuries, when scientific discoveries were rapidly expanding human knowledge of the Earth and its past, but many gaps remained. This was before plate tectonics explained the movement of continents, before radiocarbon dating allowed precise dating of ancient artifacts, before genetic analysis could trace human migrations, before satellite imagery could map every square mile of the Earth's surface. In that context of partial knowledge and unsolved mysteries, It was possible to speculate about lost continents and hidden civilizations in ways that seemed plausible at the time. Today, we know far more, and the space for such speculation has shrunk dramatically. But the myths created during that earlier period persist because they were never really about the science. They were about the need for wonder, mystery, and meaning. The human need for mystery is profound and perhaps inextinguishable. We are drawn to the unknown, to the unexplained, to the possibility that there are secrets waiting to be discovered. This is a valuable trait in many ways. It drives exploration, scientific inquiry, and creative imagination. But it can also lead us astray when we let the desire for mystery override our commitment to evidence and reason. The challenge is to maintain a sense of wonder while also being rigorous in how we evaluate claims about reality. We can be fascinated by the past without inventing false histories. We can marvel at the achievements of ancient civilizations without needing to believe they had help from lost continents or alien visitors. We can appreciate the power of myths and legends while also understanding them as myths and legends rather than historical accounts. What then should we make of James Churchward in his work on Mu? Was he a fraud, deliberately inventing a story to sell books and make money? Was he deluded, genuinely convinced of something that wasn't true? Or was he something in between? A man who started with a sincere curiosity about the past, encountered some ambiguous evidence that he misinterpreted, and then let his imagination carry him away into increasingly elaborate speculations that he eventually came to believe were true? The evidence suggests the third option is closest to the truth. Churchward seems to have been genuinely convinced that he had uncovered something important, that he had found the key to understanding human origins. His writings show the passion of a true believer, not the cynicism of a con artist. But his conviction didn't make him right, and his passion didn't substitute for evidence. In many ways, Churchward was a product of his time and place. He lived in an era when European and American intellectuals were grappling with new ideas about human origins, when racial theories and evolutionary thinking were being combined in ways that we now recognize as deeply flawed, when archaeology was still developing its methods and standards. He was influenced by theosophy and other esoteric movements that blended spirituality with pseudoscience. He had access to fragmentary knowledge about ancient cultures, enough to spark speculation, but not enough to constrain it with solid evidence. And he wrote for an audience that was hungry for stories of hidden knowledge and lost civilizations, an audience that was primed to believe in such things because of the cultural currents of the day. In this context, the creation of the moon myth makes sense, even if the myth itself doesn't correspond to reality. The continuing appeal of Mu in some quarters today is more difficult to explain, given how much more we now know. Why would anyone still believe in the lost continent when modern geology has so thoroughly ruled it out? Part of the answer is that belief in fringe theories is often about more than just evaluating evidence. It's about identity, community, and worldview. For some people, believing in Mu is a way of asserting their independence from mainstream institutions and authorities. It's a form of rebellion against the scientific establishment, which some perceive as dogmatic or closed-minded. For others, it's tied to spiritual beliefs or to a particular vision of human history that gives them comfort or meaning. And for still others, it's simply that they encountered the idea of Mu at an impressionable age, found it fascinating, and have never been exposed to compelling reasons to abandon it. They're aware that scientists reject the idea, but they interpret that rejection as evidence of bias rather than as a verdict based on evidence. This highlights an important challenge for science communication and education. It's not enough to simply present the evidence against ideas like Mu. We also need to understand why people are drawn to such ideas in the first place and address those underlying needs. If someone believes in Mu because they're looking for wonder and mystery in the past, telling them here's why Mu is impossible won't necessarily satisfy that need. We need to also show them the genuine wonders and mysteries that actual archaeology and geology reveal. The true story of human history, how our species evolved, how we migrated across the globe, how we developed language and art in complex societies, how we built the monuments and cities that still amaze us today, is far more fascinating than any invented myth. The processes that shape the earth, the slow dance of continents, the building of mountains, the filling and emptying of ocean basins, are awe-inspiring in their scale and complexity. Science doesn't drain the world of mystery. It reveals deeper mysteries and gives us tools to explore them systematically. Similarly, if someone is drawn to Mu as a golden age that we've fallen from, we can acknowledge the appeal of that narrative while also pointing out that it's based on a false nostalgia. There never was a time when all of humanity lived in peace and harmony under enlightened rule. Human history is messy, complicated, and full of both achievements and atrocities. But understanding that real history with all its complexity, is more valuable than comforting myths about a perfect past, because it helps us understand how we got to where we are and gives us realistic guidance about how to address current problems. The notion that all ancient civilizations derived from Mu or Atlantis or some other lost motherland also tends to diminish the achievements of the actual cultures in question. It suggests they couldn't have built their cities and monuments without outside help, which is both false and insulting to the real people who did that work. As we close this long exploration of Mu, let's return to where we started, the vast Pacific Ocean, where waves stretch to the horizon and depths plunge into darkness. Somewhere beneath those waves, churchward imagined, lie the ruins of a great continent, the motherland of humanity, destroyed by catastrophe 12,000 years ago. But what actually lies beneath the Pacific? Not Mu, but something equally worthy of our attention. There are underwater volcanoes and deep trenches, tectonic boundaries where the ocean floor is being created and destroyed, ecosystems thriving in the darkness of the deep sea, and a geological history written in layers of sediment and volcanic rock. There are the real remains of human history in the Pacific. Ancient Polynesian settlements on remote islands, evidence of the incredible voyages these peoples made across thousands of miles of open ocean without compasses or maps, relying on their knowledge of stars, currents, and wildlife. There are mysteries aplenty, questions that science is still working to answer about the deep ocean, about ancient human migrations, about the processes that shape our planet. The legend of Mu is a powerful reminder that humans are storytelling creatures. We create narratives to make sense of the world, to express our hopes and fears, to connect with others, and to give meaning to our existence. Not all of those stories are true, but all of them tell us something about who we are and what we value. The story of Mu tells us about our hunger for hidden knowledge, our longing for a lost golden age, our tendency to see patterns and connections even where none exist, and our willingness to believe in ideas that give us comfort or excitement even when those ideas comfort with evidence. Understanding these aspects of human nature doesn't make us superior to those who believed in Mu. It makes us aware of tendencies we all share and helps us be more thoughtful about how we evaluate claims and form beliefs. In the end, the lost continent of Mu is lost not because it sank beneath the Pacific Ocean, but because it was never there to begin with. It was lost in the sense that it was an idea that got lost in translation, from legitimate scientific speculation about biogeography to occult mysticism to pseudo-archaeological myth-making. It's a testament to the power of imagination, both in its creative aspects and in its potential to lead us astray. And it's a story that, for all its flaws, continues to speak to something in us, the part that wants to believe in wonders, that seeks meaning in the past, that looks at the vast ocean and imagines what might lie beneath. That impulse, properly channeled into rigorous inquiry and critical thinking, is what drives science forward and expands human knowledge. Improperly channeled, it creates myths that persist long after they should have been abandoned. The choice of which path to follow is ours to make. So we come to the end of our journey through the legend of the lost continent of Mu. We've traced the story from its origins in the 19th century with Augustus Lupongin's misinterpretations of Mayan texts, through James Churchward's elaborate vision of a vast Pacific civilization, to the scientific debunking that showed Mu could not have existed, and finally to the cultural legacy that keeps the myth alive in literature, spirituality, and fringe communities even today. It's been a voyage through imagination and belief, through the power of story and the importance of evidence, through human aspiration and the hard realities of geology and history. If there's one lesson to take from this exploration, it's that the pursuit of knowledge requires both openness and skepticism, both imagination and rigor. We need imagination to ask new questions, to consider possibilities that haven't been explored, to look at old evidence in new ways. But we also need skepticism to test our ideas, to demand evidence, to be willing to abandon theories that don't hold up under scrutiny. Churchward had plenty of imagination, but he lacked the skepticism that would have prevented him from building an elaborate myth on a foundation of misinterpretation and wishful thinking. Modern believers in Mu often have admirable curiosity about the past, but that curiosity is not matched by careful evaluation of the claims they encounter. The legend of Mu will likely continue for years to come, evolving and adapting as it always has, finding new forms and new audiences. Some people will always be drawn to the romance of lost continents and hidden knowledge, and there's something understandable about that attraction. But hopefully, some of those people will also be inspired to learn about the real history of our planet and our species, which is far more wonderful than any myth. The true story of Earth's geology, the genuine achievements of ancient cultures, the actual processes by which human civilization developed. These are the stories that deserve our attention and our wonder. If you found this deep dive into the legend of Mu fascinating, I hope you'll consider subscribing to this channel for more explorations of mysteries, myths, and the line between the two. Hit that like button if this video helped you understand something new about lost continents or about how we evaluate extraordinary claims. And please share your thoughts in the comments. Whether you came into this as a skeptic or a believer, whether you're fascinated by ancient mysteries or more interested in the psychology of how myths develop and persist, I'd love to hear your perspective. The conversation doesn't end with this video. It continues in the dialogue between all of us who are curious about the past and about how we know what we know. Thank you for spending these hours with me, following the trail of the lost continent of Mu from its birth in the imagination of 19th century explorers to its present incarnation as one of the enduring myths of our age. May your own explorations be guided by both wonder and wisdom, by openness to possibility and commitment to evidence. And may we all continue to seek truth while appreciating the power and beauty of the stories we tell ourselves about who we are and where we come from. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep exploring the genuine mysteries that our remarkable universe has to offer.